You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody. Lyrical Rhapsody. You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody.
Welcome to the show. I am Ginnie Love, and you are listening to Part 3 in a series of conversations with anti-racist educator and author Tim Wise on Lyrical Rhapsody. First, allow me to introduce my incredibly talented and beautiful friend who will be serving as my co-host once again, Samaria Graham. Samaria is an actress, singer, a true performer, and entertainer. She is also an activist at heart. She has many accomplishments in her field, including a regular cast member, Shelley Russo, on the 90s sitcom Blossom, as well as Izzy on the NBC series Providence. Her television appearances are extensive, but to name a few, she has appeared on Oprah Winfrey Presents ABC after-school specials, which I always loved. The episode Girlfriends dealt with racial tension and relations in an urban high school in New York City. It was nominated for an NAACP Image Award and a Daytime Emmy. She's also appeared on one of my favorite stations, PBS, ABC series Girlfriends and NYPD Blue, NBC's Law and Order, CBS's Touched by an Angel, UPN's Malcolm and Eddie, and the WB's The Wayans Brothers. So there are no stations left untouched by her presence. Samaria also starred in the 1999 CBS miniseries Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and American Love Story, where B.B. King also appeared as one of the musical stars. Her movie credits include movies made for HBO, Showtime, and Cinemax. She was also in Martin Lawrence's movie Nothing to Lose. And there are many, many other roles and credits. One of my favorites that I save for last, Samaria is a musician and a singer with her own album, Immortal. Samaria has also sung background vocals for countless bands, including R&B, rock, and hip-hop. Samaria is also featured along with the legendary poet Nikki Giovanni on the title track of the Tupac compilation CD, The Rose That Grew from Concrete, one of my all-time favorites. You can see her professional accomplishments are overflowing, but as her friend, I can tell you her greatest accomplishment, in my opinion, is her spirit and the sincerity of her passionate heart. Samaria is a gift to all that encounter her. Her mere presence intrigues your mind, dares your eyes, including the third eye, to open wider and to live life with authenticity. I love her. I introduce to you my co-host for today's show and the conversation with Tim Wise series, the magnificent Samaria Graham.
Thank you, Ginnie. I greatly appreciate that.
So now that I've gone through and I've explained, the acting, the entertaining, the music, I know that I said earlier, you're an activist at heart. Why don't you give us, the audience, some more information about the things that you have done on that realm?
Okay, well, I'll just put a little bit of sprinkle in there. I've been working with a group called City Kids out of New York City, where I met Malik Yoba, and was sort of coached by Jamal Joseph. He's a former Black Panther, and I want to call him my uncle because he's given me so much love, so much support, and kept me strong in my heart when I felt weak. And there's been a lot of people in that realm that I've walked with. I was out there. I walked for Rodney King, along with a lot of people that he introduced me to as well. So that was a long time ago, the Rodney King thing, but I can never forget what we went through.
Oh, no. Yeah,
with that. But I've been doing it since then. It's been a very long time. And I'm still standing right now. What I'm dealing with right now, we shall find out soon. It shall heal, and I shall rise.
Amen, sister. Amen.
Amen.
And I know we're both excited to get to our guest, so I'm going to just jump right in. And Tim is amazing.
Right. But before you do that, I just have to tell you why I even wanted to connect with you. I saw your heart around the time we were looking at a lot of people getting hurt, and killed, and it was a Facebook thing. And so we connected that way, and we ended up speaking to each other on the phone. And I appreciate how you've been working in the community to make changes as well. So that's what made me reach out to you. So I just have to acknowledge your heart and your passion. And it wasn't called Black Lives Matter. It was just we cared. And that's all that was going on at the time.
Thank you,
We both
Samaria.
cared.
Thank you. I remember when you first reached out to me. It was during the Trayvon Martin days, and that's been 3 years ago now. It's been over 3 years ago. And during that time, through that movement, and since, we've stayed connected, and we just saw one another on a heart level. And it's such a privilege to have come to know you as well as I do. And I look forward to the day we get to break bread together. And so thank you very much. And now on to our guest. He is among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the United States, and he has been called one of the brilliant voices of our time. He's also been referred to as one of the most brilliant, articulate, and courageous critics of white privilege in the nation by best-selling author and professor Michael Eric Dyson of Georgetown University. I believe it is important for the audience to know and understand who they are listening to and learning from, so allow me to go further into detail. Tim is the author of 9 books, including the highly acclaimed memoir, White Like Me, Reflections on Race, from a Privileged Son. Between Barack and a Hard Place, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama. Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. Colorblind, the rise of post-racial politics and the retreat from racial equality. Speaking treason fluently, anti-racist reflections from an angry white male. Affirmative action, racial preference, and black and white, education, politics, and culture. And his latest release, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. In addition, Tim has contributed chapters and essays to over 25 additional books, and his writings are taught in colleges and universities across the nation. His essays have appeared on Alternate, Salon, Huffington Post, Counterpunch, The Root, Black Commentator, BK Nation, and Z Magazine, among others. Tim has been referred to by scholar and philosopher Cornel West as a vanilla brother in the tradition of abolitionist John Brown, and that is quite a statement. He is among the nation's most prominent anti-racist essayists and educators. He has spent 20 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states, on over 1,000 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences. He has also lectured internationally and has trained corporate, government, law enforcement, medical industry professionals on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Tim also appears regularly on CNN and MSNBC to discuss race issues. So if you've been tuned in, you've definitely seen him. To read more about Tim and his extensive body of work, his official website is www.timwise.org. That's TIMWISE.org. Find him on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. That's at TIMJACOBWISE. And find him on Facebook. On a personal note, Tim means much to both Samaria and I. And Samaria, I would like to give you an opportunity to share some thoughts.
Yes, well, Tim and I have been connected through Facebook again. And we started communicating, I believe it was 2008. We were battling back and forth. And we were having arguments that was hilarious. And it never got really heated. But he always, spoke his mind. I spoke my mind. And we respected each other. And since then, we've just continually kept, reaching out to each other. And then I've been blessed enough for you to invite me to do these talks with him, and so I've been able to speak with him as well. I believe that a couple of times I've asked some questions that, I really want to hear his point of view, and I'm not trying to. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not trying to challenge him in a battle, or anything. I'm trying to challenge.
You just want his perspective. You want that introspection.
Yes,
Yeah.
and honest answers.
Which he always is eloquently, of course.
Yes, and I think that's what's so cool about speaking with you and him, because both of you guys are learning. You are willing to speak what's there, and from my point of view, as a person who's been working as a representative of all black people, because I was like the only black person in my classes a lot of times. I'm the official one, I represent everybody. So,
may I add to that, African American as well as Cherokee, right? So it's like you represent it all, right?
Yes, and Blackfoot, and I'm Puerto Rican sometimes, but we don't really have to go into that. But I really appreciate when you're speaking from a place of, you and Tim are speaking from a place of trying to connect, not trying to defend. You get what I mean?
Because but that's not where. That's because that's not where we're at. Right.
Right.
That's what you get. That's what you get the majority of times that you're having conversation, unfortunately, with white folks. But that's right. I get it.
And it makes a difference when you're trying to connect.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's why I appreciate Tim and Ginnie. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Very well put. And I agree with your sentiments about Tim. And I think that he actually enjoys it when we put questions out there that challenge him a bit. So as for myself, over the years, I actually was introduced to Tim by Samaria several years ago when we began doing this series of interviews. And during that time, I've had an opportunity to have personal conversations with him and come to know him. And he's become a brother in arms. When I'm in a place of absolute madness, heartache for the insanity and the absolute havoc racism just perpetuates, I call Tim, and he has a way of balancing me out and reminding me of where we are, what our job is, what the realities of it all are, and returning me to a space of focus. He has an undeniable gift for transmitting common sense and truth, like effortlessly. It's amazing to me to hear recorded conversations of him speaking to audiences. I'm just always amazed. And I have to say, it is especially meaningful for me to share this conversation with both Tim and Samaria, because they are not only my friends and my comrades, but they also play significant parts in their unique ways in the very personal journey I've been on completing my memoir, Black Through Blue Eyes. Tim is without doubt one of the most knowledgeable, passionate, and incredibly intelligent men of our time.
You're listening to Lyrical Rhapsody. Lyrical Rhapsody.
I want to thank everyone for joining us for a special edition of Lyrical Rhapsody. It's a continued conversation with Tim Wise and my co-host, Samaria Graham. For all of you who joined us the last two conversations, this is part 3. We're very glad that you're here. Obviously and unfortunately, we have a lot to talk about and a lot of questions that we want to ask Tim. I want to welcome to the conversation, along with Samaria Graham, Tim Wise. Thank you for being here, Tim.
You bet. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
So we have a lot to talk about, and I actually was I saw something you posted earlier on Facebook today about the All Lives Matter. And that's been a hot topic discussion on social media lately. So I'd like to jump right in there, because I was really encouraged, actually, because normally when I see someone who is white and they're and not all obviously, but the vast majority, they're responding and they don't get it, they normally respond and then there's always a but to it. But I was really encouraged today, so I want to quote someone, that random person off the internet. Her name is Christine Walsky, and she said, "For those who keep saying all lives matter have an issue with it. The point of Black Lives Matter is the implied too. Black Lives Matter too," and she put the Black Lives Matter too in capital letters. Our society has already treated whites as if they've mattered throughout history. So just dive in, just talk to us, please.
Well, I mean, all of this is just reminiscent of the long-standing way in which so many white Americans have said things like, why don't we have White History Month? Or
Right.
why don't we have a National Association for the Advancement of White People, right? It's sort of overlooking the fact that when whiteness is sort of the standard, the norm, the thing that's always covered, the thing that's always taught, the thing that's always celebrated, the people whose interests are sort of, institutionally protected, then you don't have to mention that again. It's obvious. It's like, May is White History Month. You don't have to call it that.
Right.
June is White History Month, right? And so the problem with criticizing Black Lives Matter and replacing it with All Lives Matter is twofold. One, it just furthers that whole dynamic that overlooks the fact that whiteness has generally been protected, and also it's disingenuous. I mean, that post that I put up on Facebook today was a really good example, because what that was about was a story that's received very little attention in the press. A young white man, I should point out, who was killed by an officer not very long ago, just a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I suppose. Young white man, and his story has been largely undiscussed in the media. All those people who have been criticizing black activists and white anti-racist activists for making an issue of the killing of disproportionately unarmed black and brown men and women, we never denied that. In fact, the argument I hear from our side and the Black Lives Matter side and just all of us doing this work is, you're right, a police state ultimately spreads, and if you allow violence and abuse of black and brown bodies, eventually it's going to affect white people. And when it does, as it did with this young man, the All Lives Matter folks are not out there tweeting about his life and about how terrible it is. In fact, the people who are making the most noise about this young man's death on social media are some of the key Black Lives Matter activists. I mean, they're the ones who are actually saying, see, this is what we're talking about.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. Yes, and it feels very awkward, because it almost feels as though the All Lives Matter came out just to tell Black Lives Matter to shut up.
Yeah.
Just to keep them in their place, or keep us in our place. And then,
right.
Because they're not standing up when it actually happens. I mean, this was a perfect opportunity for them to really take platform and make noise about this. And they're silent.
Right. Well, I was thinking the other day about it, and I've heard a couple of really interesting analogies too. I mean, Arthur, you had a great one early on Twitter. He said, kind of paraphrasing it here, but not by much. He said that going around yelling "All Lives Matter" is like going into a conference on AIDS and yelling, people die of other diseases too, or there was another one the other day. Someone said, if you had a parent who you were at the table and they always gave your sister more food than you at dinner, and then you were to say, you know what, I need my fair share, and then it'd be like your dad saying, well, we all need our fair share. It's sort of not the point. You're not giving out fair shares. So I mean, and what's really sad about it, I mean, this just gives you an idea of the crisis that we're in. We always talk about all the progress we've made as a country on issues of race, but think about it. We've in some ways regressed, because you cannot imagine, I certainly can't. Let's go back to the early 70s, mid-70s, when the phrase "black is beautiful" began to be used. Even then, now we're talking 40 years ago, even then, I cannot imagine white people responding to that by saying, well, white is beautiful. Like, that didn't happen. That wasn't a thing, right? No. So, I mean, it was understood that when black folks were saying that, they were saying, by God, we're beautiful too. And it was understood even in the early 70s. So here we are 40 years later, and white folks are more defensive, more fragile, more precious, right, when it comes to these issues than we were 40 years ago, which I think says a whole lot.
Yes.
It says a whole lot, and we've talked about the fact before that unfortunately, I remember being at my high school graduation, and then it just for various reasons I just knew things were going to be better, in 20 years, and we have digressed. I mean, significantly. One question that Samaria posed earlier, and it ties in with the Mikhail Neal case. We were discussing what we would talk to you about today, Tim, and she was saying, why do Christians, why don't they vehemently condemn any association, like the KKK? Why do they not condemn the KKK publicly? These are Christians. And when I read that question that she posed to me, it just brought me to the Mikhail Neal case, because Mikhail Neal, for those who do not know who he is, it's Mikel, and last name is Neal. He is a African-American firefighter in Marion, Indiana, who was thrown a noose by the assistant fire chief. And, things have progressed. It was not handled properly. The only reason there was any demotion at all was because the Washington Post broke the story nationally. And now there's been a lawsuit filed, and this is a small town in Indiana, and it's very representational for our nation as a whole. What you get there is the victim of, a noose was tied and thrown at him, and the assistant fire chief, assistant fire chief, walked out of the room. But Mikhail Neal is having folks in the community that are saying horrible things. He's the troublemaker because he's standing up for himself, for his constitutional rights. And there's no hate crime law, which is another topic, and there's 5 states that doesn't exist, and Indiana is one of them. But we talk about the South. Racism is rampant in the Midwest. It's rampant, obviously, all across the country, but especially in the Midwest. And I would just like and the majority of the reason why I bring this up is because the majority of the people that he is receiving the most backlash from call themselves Christians. So with that, I leave it to you.
Well, your initial question about why Christians, and let's be more precise, why white Christians don't condemn the Klan, I think there are a couple of obvious answers for it. Number one, of course, is that many of them would say they do, but that they don't see the Klan as a day-to-day major problem or overt white supremacist groups. They don't recognize perhaps their strengths. I think some of it's just sheer ignorance about the true ongoing reality of white supremacist groups. Maybe the Klan not being the cutting edge of them, for sure. There's no doubt white nationalism and white supremacy has moved well beyond the Klan. They're sort of the single A farm team of a much more advanced system. But I think the bigger reason why white Christians don't see it sort of as their obligation to challenge that stuff is in large part because if you think about the way that we've discussed the Klan or a lot of these white supremacist groups, they really haven't been framed in our history books or in our popular understanding as religiously motivated terrorist groups, right? We don't equate them historically with Christianity the way that ISIS is, or the Taliban, or whatever, or Al Qaeda, right, are connected to Islam. And the reason is because we focused on the racial component, which is clearly the chief motivating factor for these groups. But if you do know the history of the Klan, and you know the history of most of these organizations, not all of them, there's no doubt that this intensely racialized version of Christianity was a guiding premise for them. There's a reason that the Klan lights crosses and not just some random symbol, right? And I think that if white people had not learned of it as a Christian terrorist group, then they don't see the need as Christians to condemn it, even if they really are appalled by the Klan. Even a lot of white people who truly are appalled by them wouldn't necessarily see the connection to their particular faith, because it's also the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Which is, well, basically these people aren't Christians if they act that way. Well, that's convenient. I mean, to say that they're not Christians because they act in a way that isn't your Christianity, it's the kind of argument we don't accept from ISIS supporters. It's like if someone says, well, this isn't really Islam, people, right-wingers say, well, yeah, it is. Well, in fact, it is a version of Islam. It's a perverted version of Islam. And anyone can see it. Well, these are perverted versions of Christianity. So I think those are the reasons that Christians are not stepping up. But I really think all of this is connected. I mean, if you want to understand the thread that runs through, the All Lives Matter pushback, the condemnation of Black Lives Matter, the pushback against this individual in Indiana, the Donald Trump phenomenon, all of these things that are going on right now. And the common thread is the thing that I was talking about in the book Dear White America, which is this rising tide of white racial anxiety that has been brought on by rapid cultural change. And I mentioned in that book, there were four things going on. One was the election of a president of color. One was the economic meltdown confronting whites with a level of uncertainty that we really hadn't been used to since the Great Depression. The third thing was the popular culture shifting to a thoroughly multicultural, highly integrated form of culture, which, challenges the normalcy of sort of whiteness. And then finally, the demographic shift, which we know, within 30 years is going to put the country about half people of color, half white. When you put all of those things in a blender and you mix them up, what you get is this increasing white anxiety, white resentment, white fragility. That's why when you say Black Lives Matter, in 2015, it gets this fear response and this anger in a way that Black is Beautiful 40 years ago didn't, right? Because Black people in 1971 saying Black is beautiful, white folks could just sort of roll their eyes if they didn't like it, but they didn't feel threatened by otherness because they were still the overwhelming dominant norm, and they could those Black people, they can talk about how beautiful they are and wear their afros and their dashikis, and who really cares, right? But in 2015, if those kinds of cultural statements and political statements come with a little bit more potential power and a little bit more potential influence, and all of a sudden those same white folks freak out. And so when a Black man says, hey, this is how I was victimized on the job, it's not so much that white folks who are pushing back on him, some of them maybe, but I would say maybe most of them are not necessarily in favor of what happened to him. What they're afraid of is the assertion of Blackness itself, and the assertion that by God, we're not going to be silent while this happens, scares a lot of those white folks because they know that it ain't just that case. And they know that ultimately, if he stands up, it sort of symbolizes a broader uprising of Black and brown bodies, talking about everything from police brutality to discrimination in the workforce to unequal education to mass incarceration to all of that. So when Donald Trump, is able to tap into this xenophobic nativist stuff, it's also part of that white anxiety. It's just the updated Tea Party, I want my country back thing, but it's all it's all of a piece. All of this pushback is because whiteness, for the first time, systemically, is being challenged, being interrogated by the actions of people of color in a way that, for the first time, seems like it could actually have some impact. Whiteness was always challenged by Black folks, but at a time when Black and brown folks were not nearly as large a percentage of the population, not nearly as influential within the mass culture, not nearly as strong politically. And so I think that's what we have to understand about this.
I'd like to ask you, the last conversation you and I had, we were talking about the fact that, this wound has, it's been there this whole time. Because there was actually, I think it was Rolling Stone that it was released. Tom Petty, the rock singer Tom Petty, had said something. They were discussing the Confederate flag, and he was, stating that at one time he didn't see a problem with it, but he understands that, for Black people that it had, so he was talking about that. But then at the end of the statement, he said, but what I'm much more concerned about is the, like the sudden increase this said, he made it made it sound very much like it was a new thing happening of Black lives, like these Black men, these Black people being murdered and nothing's being done about it. And when I read it, it just obviously gives you shivers because it's been going on the whole time. Obviously, it's just now through all of these different medias, and for whatever reason, it's getting the attention that it deserves. So where do you feel we are as a nation, and that infection? I mean, talk about that. Talk about that wound and infection and how we heal it.
Well, I mean, the point you make about Tom Petty's comment is very prescient, because what's interesting is actually, in a purely quantitative sense, so far as we know, and again, the records are horribly kept by police agencies and by the federal government, so one never really knows. But all the available evidence we have actually says that cases of police violence in general, and specifically against African Americans, actually dropped. So, which means not only has it always been around, it was actually probably worse 10 years ago, and 15 years ago, and 20 years ago. Just like crime itself has dropped, police violence has also dropped. Now, it's still ridiculously high.
You're saying that the numbers, the statistics right now are saying that the crime has actually dropped, that the shootings...
Yeah, it's actually dropped since the 70s and the 80s, which actually, frankly, makes sense, because the crime rate was much higher in the 70s and 80s than it is now. Most people think crime has gone up. It hasn't. It's gone down. And so, obviously, since you can imagine, crime rates are probably going to be correlated to aggressive policing, right? Cops are really going to get crazy when crime is high. So none of that is surprising, and none of that, by the way, is intended to downplay the insanely violent acts of police that we've seen in the last couple of years. But it is to say that if anything, this was going on with much more regularity 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the difference, of course, is rather obvious. We didn't have the access both to social media and also, the kind of videography that people can do. I mean, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, unless you were relatively affluent, you didn't have a camera that you walked around with everywhere. You didn't have a video camera. You certainly didn't have the means to upload that somewhere and have that get seen. I mean, remember how sort of revelatory it was for people watching Rodney King getting beaten in 1991. I mean, for an awful lot of people, that was just like, what in the world? And people knew it happened. But the fact that it was on video was just sort of, stunning for people. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. I think that sometimes, the assumption is that these things are getting worse when in fact we're maybe just more aware of them. But either way, we need to be cognizant of what the experiences are, because for every one of these incidents that ends with a death, there are hundreds and maybe no doubt thousands of incidents that don't end with death or maybe even serious physical injury, but which end with the nonetheless very palpable and disturbing psychological injury to communities that feel like they are considered suspects first and humans second. I mean, there were hundreds of thousands of black and brown folks stopped and frisked in New York during the height of the stop and frisk policy there. Most of them certainly not killed by cops, most of them not even beaten. But even if they weren't beaten, the fact that they were stopped and frisked and searched, and ultimately in 94% of the cases hadn't actually done anything, was nonetheless a form of psychological torture. It's a way of saying to communities, you don't count, your lives really don't matter, your rights certainly don't matter, and our right to treat you like the enemy outweighs your right to be treated like an American with rights and protections under the Constitution. So I think sometimes we focus only on issues of really over-the-top brutality or police murder, we're missing that there's a whole edifice of unequal treatment below that, and we don't want to lose sight of that or lose sight of the fact that that's the day-to-day thing. Thankfully, the killing, the completely unjustifiable killing of unarmed people is not an hourly thing, not yet, and hopefully it won't be, but the stopping and the frisking and the profiling and the suspicion most certainly is, and I would hate for us to only focus on the most extreme versions and forget about all the other systemic stuff that's happening every minute.
Yes, and it just feels so arbitrary, and the way it weighs on you, and like, you wake up in the middle of the night, you can't sleep through the night. When you go through your day, I don't want to say panic attacks, but you have times where You look over your shoulder and you're worried. And there's the place of peace is hard to find in your weekly and daily existence. And one of the things that I'm challenged with is, I've purchased property and they won't allow me to build my home that I've already purchased a home as well. But the neighbors that are including cops, police officers, have spoken to people so that they won't do the contracting work, so that they won't do the work, and so that they will also, stop me, follow me, and do things like that. And those types of things are terrorizing, and it really makes it hard to breathe, hard to function, hard to think. And that's like a slow death. And those kind of things are just horrific. They are horrific. You don't know when they're going to do something. If they had a bad day, if this day, this is the day they're going to do something else against you. And it's just scary. And the only reason, it has nothing to do with how I've lived my life or how I care about my community. It only has to do with their imagination and my color. And that really hurts my spirit. And I think that that's what you're talking about. Those types of things weigh heavily on Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that people can be doing if we didn't have to exist that way.
Right.
We could be so much more abundant in how we live in this life and create and build if we weren't always having to look backwards while we're trying to move forward.
Right. I mean, I think that's an incredibly underappreciated aspect of how racism operates. So oftentimes, we're looking for the very obvious videotapable manifestation of how white supremacy operates, and occasionally, we do find those. But what you're describing is far deeper and far more of a process, and it's the kind of thing that, it does show up in evidence. It shows up in mortality statistics. It shows up in blood pressure and hypertension statistics. It shows up in the fact that black folks have 9 years less life expectancy on average than white folks. It shows up in infant mortality statistics. I mean, in my book, Colorblind, I have a section about racism in healthcare, and one of the really important points that I don't think is understood, and even very much so by the president and some of his folks, they seem to think that the key to closing racial health disparities is simply making sure that black folks have got access to healthcare. Well, that's obviously an important thing for everyone. However, the data on racial disparities says that it's not mostly about black people not having insurance and white people having insurance. It's not mostly about whether you have access to a doctor. It's about the fact that people of color disproportionately are facing a number of challenges in their lives directly related to race that have a psychological impact that cause a disproportionate release of stress hormones like cortisol in the body, such that even, let's say, for instance, African-American women who have college degrees, who have jobs and income that put them solidly in the middle class, who have access to health care, still have rates of low birth weight children and infant mortality that are double the rates of white women who didn't even finish high school. Now think about that. White women who didn't even finish high school, who almost by definition are not going to have really good jobs and really good income, and they're more likely to be poor, they're more likely to not have health care, at least not good preventive health care. Those white women are still having better outcomes for their newborns than black women who've done everything right, everything that society tells them to do, got a degree, stayed in school, got a good job, made good money, and they're still having, greater impacts. We know that African immigrants to this country, when they show up here, they actually have health outcomes in that first generation that are pretty much identical to whites. So that's sort of the good news, right? Folks come here from Africa, their health is pretty solid. By the time their children, the next generation, and their grandchildren, their health outcomes have deteriorated to the level of African Americans. So something is happening, clearly ain't genetic, it ain't cultural, right? There's something happening in this country to the black body in terms of what it is experiencing that ain't going to show up on YouTube, because I can't show you cortisol being released in your bloodstream on YouTube. I cannot show you what 9 years less life expectancy looks like in a 5-minute clip or a Vine video or a Snapchat, right? This is where we miss this picture, and that's really what we got to get to as a society, is having this conversation about the way, this insidious way in which stuff that's going on in the background is really what's killing folks,
I'm back here just like I can't hold back because I have a psychology degree. I have a mental health degree. I mean, this is what I do. I'm a psychotherapist, and I see it for myself all of the time working in the community that, post-traumatic stress disorder, it just flat out diagnosable. It's all there. And it's just so overlooked and not appreciated or acknowledged. And so what you just said is just yes, 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 thank you. I mean, it's so infuriating and it's so frustrating and all of those things to try to have these conversations. And it's, one thing that I found, when I was a new graduate and I was, ready to go out, and I had all these tools and I was going to help the world. I couldn't wait to do that. And then when I got out there, I realized that, I couldn't use a lot of the tools. I had to get down on the level of folks that I was working with, and they weren't ready for the fancy terminology or any of that. And that's where we are here, because it doesn't matter what the educational level is of any white person or any person who is, racist. When you sit down to have a conversation with them, it is literally like, taking them to kindergarten. And so my own anger has been, when I say this, I say it because I'm frustrated and I want to balance it, because I do not want to be an angry person. I'm Ginnie Love, for heaven's sakes. I mean, this is what I do. I have found myself lately becoming more and more angry. I was speaking to Samaria, I think it was yesterday. My daughter, I have two daughters, and my oldest daughter is 25, and her father is African American, and we were having a discussion over the last incident. A young man was shot and killed, pulled over, had done nothing, and she's talking about getting a gun. And I know statistically that if she gets that gun, she's more likely to be killed by it than to use it in defending herself. But and we've had the conversations ever since she, before she could drive. If if someone's pulling you over, you call 911. You let them, you have your tag number in your car. You read it to them, tell them you will pull over as soon as you have a lighted area, and then you do that, and then you keep 911 on the call, let the officer know, and that's how you handle it. But my 25-year-old daughter, in order to feel safe in a major city, we're in Orlando, feels the need to have a gun, and that angers me. That is my child. For kids who are, or young adults, for young adults that feel the way my daughter do, that, they have to have a weapon in order to protect themselves because they are in fear. You were speaking earlier to the psychological effects that, this has, but for young people that are feeling that way, and many are getting weapons, whether they're being trained on them or not, what would you say to them? Like when you speak at colleges or what have you?
I think that, it's hard to answer the question without maybe seeming a little melodramatic to some, but this is, really and truly, here's the thing, and I'm 46, I'll be 47 in October, and so, mathematically, and just given the history of my own family, I'm in all likelihood, quite a few years past the halfway mark of my expected life, and for 25 years roughly, I've been doing this kind of work, and really maybe a little bit longer than that. And I think, when I was 18, 19, 20, and in my mid 20s, I didn't really realize how fast that next 20 to 25 years would go.
Absolutely.
And I didn't realize both how much would change in some ways for the better in society around these issues, but how much would also change for the worse. And in the blink of an eye, that time has gone by. So I think what young adults have to do, and it's not just with regard to this issue, frankly, it's just with regard to life in general. The only advice I can give someone is, you have a very limited amount of time on this earth, and in the greater scheme of things, it's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. If you're lucky, you might get 85 years. If you're really lucky, you might get a bit more than that. But the fact is, it's a very small amount of time to sort of figure out what you're going to be about and what you're going to stand for in this world. And as a people, human beings have a real tendency, sometimes really destructive and dysfunctional. It's probably the root of all war and most conflict. We have a tendency to try to achieve immortality. We don't want to die. That's why we kill. We don't want to die. That's why we occupy people's countries and take their stuff. We're trying in some existential way to prolong our lives, our power, our existence. We build monuments to ourselves that will be everlasting. And we all do this. Some do it with horribly pernicious motives. Others of us write books and hope that they'll be around forever. That, too, is a way of trying to achieve some sick form of immortality. I guess my point is, if that's a human condition, and to some extent it is, then let's at least figure out a way to do that that's productive. If we want to achieve some form of so-called immortality, let that immortality be that we, begin to build institutions that are about lasting justice. And I think that's possible. I think that that's doable. But it means that young adults have to figure out what they care about, what they're passionate about, what they stand for earlier rather than later. Because I assure you, if you try to start doing this stuff and thinking about this stuff and making a difference on these issues only by the time you're in your 40s, it's a lot harder because now you've got a lot more responsibilities and you don't have nearly as much energy and you got more fears and more other stuff going on. The younger you start not only caring about stuff but acting on those concerns, the more that this becomes normalized behavior, and it just becomes who you are. And so I think that's the task of young people, is to figure out who you are and who you want to be in the world and how you want to spend your time in this place. And sort of, as James Baldwin said, earn your death. Sort of a macabre phrase, but it's one that speaks a lot to me, this notion that, you have to earn your death by the way that you live your life. And I think that's, as strange as it may sound, I think it's a philosophy that it's actually pretty helpful.
No, that's fabulous. Thank you for sharing that. I just have another question for you, and it's the aftermath of Charleston. For obvious reasons, it's seared into our memories. Earlier that day, actually around 2 p.m., I had a conference call with one of the directors at the King and Center in Atlanta, and it was something I had been working toward and I was so excited about, and it was just a very surreal, obviously, day, but for that to happen, and I was very excited about what the King Center was doing and possibilities there, and then only hours later, I turned on the news, and something that you would never imagine would happen again happened. And so, in the days after Charleston, as a nation, in your opinion, where are we?
I don't think we've learned the lesson of Charleston. I think we're drawing a lot of the wrong conclusions. I think we pat ourselves on the back for, the fact that, the perpetrator, has been caught. And that the families, were so kind to, offer him a certain forgiveness and, which, one can be moved by that, but not make too much of it. Obviously, if you're the victim of horrific crime, it's probably good for the soul to offer some forgiveness, but I'm afraid that white folks sometimes take black people's forgiveness as weakness, when it obviously is not. That forgiveness was offered from a place of strength. It was offered from a place that said, I'm not going to let you dictate my emotions in the way that I live the rest of my life. Ain't nothing weak about that, but I think sometimes that's how people hear it. I think the lesson we really didn't take away from it, and this, I think this is a big one. Everybody said in the wake of the killing that, Dylan Roof clearly just doesn't understand what America's about. He just doesn't understand. He just didn't pay attention. And I think, and Nikki Haley, the governor of South Carolina, said that with regard to the Confederate flag. And she agreed that it should come down. In her statement, she said something like, Dylan Roof, thinks that flag stands for hatred. He just doesn't understand it like we do. No, actually, Dylan Roof understood it way better than you do, Nikki Haley. And in fact, Dylan Roof learned the lessons of his country far better than most. And not just the lessons of the Confederate States of America, the lessons of the United States of America. And that lesson is that he is superior and that it is his country. Where did Dylan Roof hear that? Yeah, he heard it on the Council of Conservative Citizens website. Well, first of all, that's a group that's been linked over the years to dozens of mainstream Republicans. so it's not as if that's just some fringe organization. Secondly, the kind of rhetoric that they put out there about the country being overrun by those people, quote unquote, is the same message that you're hearing from Donald Trump's people. It's the same message that you're hearing from Ann Coulter's new book. It's the same message that you hear over and over from very mainstream right-wing commentators. So, I mean, it seems to me Dylan Roof paid very close attention. Now, I don't mean to be cynical and suggest that the only lesson America has to offer is one of white supremacy. Obviously, America has a lot of lessons that it teaches, but that is surely one of them. And there are others that are far better than that one, but he learned that one really, really well. And to act as if his actions were aberrant, they're only aberrant in the sense that most people are not disturbed enough to walk into a church, sit in prayer with folks for an hour, and then kill them all. Like that's aberrant. But what is not aberrant is to think the way that he thought and to believe that his way of life and his country, notice the possessive form that he used. He said, you're raping our women and you're taking over our country. That's a possessive form. It's what George Lipsitz referred to in his book as the possessive investment in whiteness. Whiteness in this country, as Cheryl Harris, UCA Law School, says, is property. And unless we understand that white folks have been taught to think of it as property and to defend it just like they would defend their house or their car or their purse or their iPhone, and more than those, because our whiteness is the one thing that has always been given far more value than any of those things I just mentioned. And so Dylan Roof paid very close attention. He learned the lesson well. I think the rest of us need to learn it as well as he did so that we can guard against it.
That was an excellent answer. Desmond Tutu said, if you're neutral on situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. That takes me to the topic of restorative justice. I'm from Marion, Indiana. That's where I was born and raised as a child. And that is the city that is known as the last public lynching. The anniversary of that was this past weekend, August 7th. It was the 85th anniversary. That happened just prior to the Holocaust. And so I'm just curious. This is something Samaria and I have spoken of as well. We've talked about. Do you believe, because Germany, and this is something that I actually didn't know until recently, Germany apologized, paid reparations, and they are still doing things for survivors of the Holocaust that are still alive. Obviously, slavery, something and everything associated with it has been going on for hundreds of years, but the last public lynching is 85 years ago. So do you believe that if that had happened, if we had, as a country, taken responsibility, do you believe that would have led us to be in a different place than we are today?
Well, I have an answer to it. I am interested, since you said you've talked this over with Samaria. I'd love to hear her answer first, and then I'll be happy to weigh in. But what do you think?
Well, as far as do I think if reparations had been addressed before now, would it make a change? Yes. I think that if part of reparations means stopping killing us and stopping putting barriers in front of us for work, for life, for education, if that was included in reparations, yes, if creating situations where we have fallback attorney systems, lawyers, and things like that, when we do come up against issues that challenge us, yes, if those were elements of reparations, including individual monetary compensation, just as the slave owners were given monetary compensation for the quote-unquote loss of their slaves, then I think we would be in a different place because it would change the basic system of how we function.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, obviously to ask what would have happened if it had been done at the time is probably moot, only because not only did it not happen, there's no way it was going to. I mean, clearly, in the wake of not only the lynching in Marion, but the lynching of the Scottsboro boys and the legal lynching of the Scottsboro boys and others, reparation or even offer apologies. I think in the more recent era, certainly the conversation around both apologies and substantive repair have been enjoined in ways that we haven't seen so much in past decades. And that's certainly, I think, a positive thing. I'm of the mind of same mind as Randall Robinson several years ago when he wrote the book To Death. I guess that was in the mid '90s to late '90s. One of the first sort of popularized books in recent memory to really talk a lot about the notion of reparations. And Robinson's argument in that book was, even though he didn't really expect that reparations were ever going to be paid in any way, shape, or form, and that probably would never happen, as I recall him saying. He said, it really wasn't entirely the point, that there was value in the conversation, that there was value in reckoning with history, that there was value in the acknowledgement of the pain, because then at the very least we might be able to move forward some significant changes in the way that we do things, whether that's the criminal justice system, the job market, schools. He said that even at the same time that he certainly advocated and supported reparations, and it's what I've said for a long time as well. I think the challenge for us is certainly to go beyond apology. Lots of countries have apologized for things. Like you said, Germany's actually had to make real monetary compensation. We as a country actually made real monetary compensation to the direct victims of Japanese internment. It's a little more complicated, I suppose, from a logistical standpoint, only precisely because white supremacy waited out so long since the history of enslavement. It becomes harder to trace direct lines of how reparations would operate. But I do think that what most reparations advocates advocate, and certainly what I advocate, is systemic institutional repair. Much more so than individual checks being written. I think white people get this idea when they hear reparations, and maybe some black folks do too. But I know white folks do. They have this vision that every month they're going to have to write a check to black people like they do the water company, right? Like it's here's my electric bill, here's my gas bill, here's my black people bill, and of course that is not what anyone of whom I'm aware in the reparations movement is talking about. Reparations are not owed from white people as white people. They're owed by the government of the United States of America and or those state governments and or private entities like corporations whose parents maybe existed back in the day, who have still, insurance companies, things like that, that insured slave policies, banks, things like that. It's institutions. Now, I get it, right? If it's the government gets its money from taxes. So yes, in effect, people are paying in. Of course, the irony of that is black folks pay taxes. So in a way, black folks would be contributing to the same fund. But I have a feeling most black and brown folks would be okay with that if they thought there was going to be substantial investment coming back into those communities. And when I say substantive reparation, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about systemic investment. If you just think about it, we have models for this, and I'm not even talking about reparation models. We have public policy models, what we did in Europe after World War II for our enemies with the Marshall Plan, rebuilding their countries, what we did in this country with regard to the GI Bill and VA loans and FHA loans, which in practice were pretty much whites-only policies. I mean, people of color gained a little bit of access to them, but very, very little. They were largely racially restricted. So we did all of this. We did all of the Homestead Act of 1862, 240 million acres of virtually free land given out to white farmers. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we do know how to do this. We know how to do big investment policies. The only difference is we've done them in the past with an eye towards advantaging really only whites, and leaving everyone else out. In a sense, reparations, as I'm describing it, as systematic reinvestment into communities of color, is simply doing what we refused to do 50 years ago or 100 years ago when we were doing it for everyone else. It's basically people of color and communities of color getting the investment that they would have gotten anyway had it not been for the racially restrictive policies that made them ineligible for the very same benefits that we were already giving to white people. It's basically giving folks their fair share of that. And saying, you shouldn't have been left out of this in the first place. And if you hadn't been left out, we might not have a situation like we have in Ferguson, where the poverty rates are so high and the unemployment rates are so high, and it's an isolated community and lacking infrastructure. All of that would have been very different had investments. I mean, St. Louis was a great example of how FHA loans and VA loans were so racially restrictive for white communities as opposed to the urban core of the St. Louis area. And so, I mean, we subsidized segregation. We financed white flight. We subsidized these inequalities, not just because of slavery. Slavery is just one piece of it, and certainly not the most recent. It's all this other stuff. So we've got models for how to do it. And I think that's what we really want to talk about, more so than this idea of white people writing checks to black people. It's not about that.
Yeah, but I know. Well, I sort of didn't know that people thought that white people would write checks to black people. I've never heard of that.
Oh yeah, no, that's seriously what I think most.
I agree with Tim. I think that people, they visualize it that way.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I do agree with a lot of what you said, but I also do agree that individually, everybody, you said it might be hard, but it's not going to be impossible. One of the other things that has to be done is every single black person needs to be given their DNA and an availability to go back to Africa to find their home, because I've been in airports where Irish people are talking about their generations and stuff like that, and we can't do that. And I don't know how frustrating it is. Frustrating to be sitting there going, yeah, my great uncle is the souls from the Ireland and blah, blah, blah. And like, I can't tell them anything. I can't say a daggone thing. I'm done. I can say my grandmother, and there we are. My great grandmother, and I'm finished. I can't tell you where specifically, what tribe or anything. I did my blood test, which I think that the government should pay for every single person who wants to get their blood
I
screened.
agree, absolutely.
What tribe, and they should also have at least 5 years of being able to travel so that they can connect to their families or something like that. Because I mean, one of the biggest things about like the mafia, Italians, and all these other movies and white people is they talk about their roots and how important it is to know your family, but we don't have that.
Right.
And
well, definitely. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that has to be included as well, because making that connection is sort of huge to me personally.
Right. Well, yeah, I think systemic repair could involve a process whereby a fund was established for that kind of thing, but obviously there'll be some folks who won't care to take advantage of it, but there'll be lots who would.
Right.
And so that way, but here's the only caveat, right? You don't want the government to control that DNA, because to me, the thing that I would worry about, right, is if the government gets your DNA, they might pay for it, but I don't want them holding the information, because you never know what folks are going to use that for. We know there are drug companies that are trying to target very specific medications to black folks on the assumption that they are racially specific in terms of how they work. Well, we know that that's nonsense, because race is not a biological thing. So they're taking advantage of these DNA markers that exist, certain haplotype groups that maybe cluster among people from sub-Saharan Africa. But then they're developing medications so that they can get rich off of black folks, when in fact there are plenty of people who would be classified as black for whom that medicine would not work because of other aspects of their genetic ancestry. So we just want to make sure that wherever the repository is, where that information is held, is something that for-profit companies won't have access to, that the government itself would not have access to, but that the individuals would be able to control. It just, would need some quality control. But I definitely, go ahead.
I was going to say, the way the company does it is they destroy it. I think they destroyed the swab and everything a month after you receive your test and you give all your information back. They destroy it.
Oh, well, good. Yeah, as long as that's done, as long as we know that's been done. Because I definitely agree with the concept you're putting forward. I mean, genealogy.
We can't trust the government.
Genealogy is a huge privilege, and it's one that you don't really think about until you start to track it. And so, when I wrote the second edition of White Like Me, and then the third edition several years back, is when I first really went back and started adding a lot. I mean, I already had some family history in there, but I'd gotten on Ancestry.com, and I was sort of tooling around with it, and I kept finding all these things that were really quite fascinating, and it literally became so seductive. That's how much of a privilege it is, because you find yourself sitting there and every time, they even do this on the commercials for Ancestry.com, right, where they have these people that are like, I put in my information, I didn't really know anything, and then up popped a leaf, and then another leaf, and then another leaf, and all the leaves are, these symbols for clues going back in your history. And I'll be damned if that isn't exactly how it worked, because when I was sitting there and I kept getting all these leaves, I was like, oh boy, another connection, right? So then, and I remember one night, I started at about 8 o'clock after dinner, and 7 o'clock in the morning came, and I hadn't gone. I hadn't gone to sleep, and my wife, and I hadn't even realized what time it was. My wife comes in, having woken up, and says, "Did you come to bed?" And I looked at the clock, and I thought, "Oh my God," because I was so enthralled. And I mean, but just to give you an idea of what a privilege it is to be able to, first of all, spend 12 hours and still not run out. Like, I didn't even come close to running out of people. Like, I was able to trace back on certain lines of my family, not very far, like the Russian Jewish immigrant line. It's a total dead end after my great-grandfather, unfortunately. But on my mom's side, on my mom's dad and my mom's moms, there were various iterations at some point that I was literally able to trace back, not hundreds of years, thousands of years.
Wow.
I was able to go back literally, like, in some cases with accuracy. The further back you get, the more you think it might be BS. But easily 1,300 years, 1,400 years into the past, because on those particular little branches of the tree, there was some sick and lamentable connection to royalty, about which I'm not at all happy, but it's, it is what it is. And the thing about royalty is they kept really good records, right? Because they wanted to make sure that they knew who was getting their shit. So basically, in my case, on those lines, I'm able to trace all of this stuff. And again, a lot of the people to whom I was connected, it was sort of sickening to recognize, but at the same time, man, it was intoxicating. And to be able to look at the history of your family and say to yourself, wow, the history of my direct family traces the history of the human race. And here's what was happening in this country when they were there. And here's what was happening. It's really like, you talk about that phrase, this land is my land, man. When you can trace your family to that land, that gives that phrase meaning. And when you can't do that, or can't do that as directly, it makes you feel really empty. And even in my case, like I said, I can go back real far on those, but I mean, I feel horribly empty about that one family that I can't trace back. I can only imagine if I feel empty about that, right, how the disproportionate number of African American folk, a disproportionate number of indigenous brothers and sisters, who aren't able to do that, how they feel, because that's their larger story. For me, it's the exception. The exception. But for a lot of folks, that's the norm.
As I'm listening to you, I'm just thinking that this is just a continued form, like to not discuss reparations and in the format that you were first speaking of. It's just a continuation of resentment, of suppression. And what I really don't get is even if whites don't want to be the good person, or let's take accountability, even realizing that by doing these things, putting monies into these communities, building them up, what they should have already had, as you stated so well, that we're actually building the country by doing that. So it literally is this childish 4-year-old behavior of where I would rather, as my mom says, cut my nose off to spite my face than to do well.
Right. Well, I mean, it's basic economics that unfortunately people don't quite understand. The idea that somehow, pumping billions or trillions of dollars of investment into communities of color would be just throwing money away is the kind of thing you can only believe because A, you're sort of racist, but also B, because you don't understand basic demand side economics. I mean, the truth is, if you pump $1 trillion, let's just take that as a figure. I'm not necessarily saying that's the one, but just say if there were $1 trillion of new investment in communities that are currently woefully under-resourced and marginalized, do we not understand that money doesn't just sit around? It doesn't just gather dust. That money gets spent. It gets spent on hospitals and schools and daycare centers and businesses, and it gets spent by consumers who then turn around and buy products, and those products have to be made by somebody, so that means jobs. And I mean, we're talking about a multiplier effect, as economists call it, that would spin out of the economy 7, 8, 9 times before it really spun out completely. So for every dollar that you put in, you might get $6, $7, $8, $9 back in economic growth and or productive investment. So, again, this would actually be very smart, unlike doing what folks on the right would prefer to do, which is give people who are already multimillionaires and billionaires tax cuts. Well, if I'm already a billionaire, cutting my taxes by a couple $100,000 a year doesn't mean shit to me. Right? I mean, like, what am I going to do with the extra $100,000? I'm going to sock it away in the bank because I can only buy so many yachts. I can only buy so many private planes. I can only be in one vacation destination at a time. It's not like I can split myself like an atom and have part of me in Belize and the other part of me in New Zealand. Like, I can only, there's only 365 days in the year. You can only consume so much caviar and expensive wine. So, I mean, so if you're really talking about an economic payoff, cutting more money in the hands of people who are already very wealthy. I write about this in my new book. Just even the fact that we tax capital gains income at such a low rate relative to labor income, not only does that hurt working people, it's a huge preferential treatment for the rich, and it's going to save the average member of the wealthiest 1% in this country about $132,000 a year as of next year. Every year they will save in taxes because the income that they receive, which is based more on their investments or rent or royalties or their stock or whatever, is taxed at a lower rate than the money that's made by a firefighter or a construction worker or whatever it is. $135,000 a year roughly that they're going to save. What are we going to do with that? As opposed to if you pumped in trillions of dollars into communities that don't have that money, and even if it only came to roughly on average of maybe $30,000 or $40,000 per person, I guarantee you that investment and the value that would produce in those communities and throughout the state and throughout the country would be far greater than the $135,000 for your average, multimillionaire.
And when you're saying that, that takes me to and reminds me of, and I'm sure you have some numbers on this or more information, obviously the for-profit prison plantations that we have. The fact that President Obama has been speaking out on this I'm speechless. I mean, I was really surprised with some of the things that he's doing in the last days of his presidency. So I would love to hear what you thought when you saw that. And anything that you have to say on the topic itself.
Well, I hadn't seen anything he said about private prisons, so I'm not up to speed on what it is that he said in that regard. I know, in general, he's been a little bit more vocal about the justice system itself, and offered a certain, still relatively limited number of presidential pardons in the last month. Great, I guess. I'm a little cynical about it. I mean, I'm a little cynical about it only because, it doesn't take a lot of guts, in my estimation, to talk about the racist impact of mass incarceration when you're not only on the way out the door, but more importantly, you've ceded control of the Congress to the other side. So he can talk all he wants about how we need all this stimulus and how we need to raise taxes on the rich. I mean, he started talking about this like the week after the midterm election. Well, okay, you can talk about all that, and you ain't going to get none of it. I mean, so I get it. It's fine, and I'd certainly rather him talk about it than not talk about it. I suppose maybe that sets up the next, presidential campaign for people to talk about it. Fabulous. But I just, it's part of me that just sort of says, well, once again, it just goes to show that whatever progress we're going to make on those issues is probably going to continue as it always has, to rely on activists and organizers and not presidents, because they're only going to do it when it's politically, safe and expedient to do it. The rest of us have to do it at all times, even when it's not. As far as my own views about the private prison industry, I do write about this in the new book, briefly, a couple pages worth. And
so what is the name? What is the name of your new book again?
It's Under the Affluence, and it's really more about how we view and treat and speak about poor folks in this country, but it has obviously a lot of stuff about race as well and connected to that. But the part on private prisons, I mean, basically, trying to make the point. It's in a section where I'm talking about this myth that the rich, are rich because they're just so brilliant and they're so smart and work so hard. So here you have a private prison industry that's very profitable.
Yeah.
CCA is a very profitable company, for instance. And yeah, let's just break it down and be real honest. That company, Corrections Corporation of America, and the others that run private prisons, not one of them could be profitable if it were not for the fact that the government, that is to say the public sector, has made a decision to incarcerate so many people. No matter how brilliant the executives at CCA might be, and I don't give them credit for being particularly bright, but let's just say they're geniuses. It doesn't matter. Unless our country commits to locking people up even for nonviolent offenses, then no matter how brilliant they are, they can't make a profit. The only reason they are profitable is because of government intervention in the lives of millions of people, criminalizing, health behavior, health issues like drug use or drug addiction, criminalizing things that really could be dealt with far differently through models of restorative justice. And they certainly wouldn't be able to turn a profit just based on the incarceration of murderers and rapists. There just aren't enough of those to earn a profit. So CCA relies, and we know this because they actually lobby state governments, and they lobby them to increase incarceration and penalties and sentences. Now they're getting into the business of detaining immigrants and undocumented folks. And so they rely, and they are the biggest welfare recipients out there because they are relying on the generous hand of the state to feed them the very raw material that allows their company to make a dime. It's the most disgusting business, and it's not just them. It's all think about the companies that make money because of them. So you have Global Tel-Link, which is the phone company that is pretty much a monopoly within the prisons and jails of this country, and they charge exorbitant rates for phone calls. They have a virtual monopoly. They make billions of dollars. The healthcare providers are only a couple of them that provide all the healthcare for prisons and jails in this country. They're making hand over fist because there's no competition and there's no concern with cost control. All of this is and fundamentally, if you've got a company like CCA and others who go out and what they do is they lobby for not only greater levels of incarceration, but they actually get states to sign incarceration guarantees. So what this means is basically you go to the state and you say, we're going to build this prison, but you have to promise us you're going to keep it at 85% capacity. And if you don't meet that, then you have to pay us like a penalty to make up the difference, right? So essentially what that means is states, and they're doing this, states are signing these agreements. What states are doing basically is they're agreeing to pay a low crime tax if they actually do a good job of reducing crime. So it's like if they go out and do what they're supposed to do and they have effective law enforcement and crime drops, which we all think is a great idea, then unfortunately you won't have enough people to lock up and you'll have to pay this private company millions of dollars in a penalty. It's absurd, and yet we're agreeing to do that in state after state after state. And so, I think it both speaks to the economic bankruptcy of the country, but also the moral and ethical bankruptcy of the country, and the fact that it's such a hot investment, and very few people are willing to speak against it and suggest that, maybe you ought not be able to have a private prison. Maybe there are certain things that are not put out for the free market, and maybe that's one of them. Just actually, no, you can't do that. There are private things that you can't do in this country, and maybe that ought to be one. Starting a for-profit prison. That's just one of them. No, you don't do that anymore,
I just want to say briefly, there's been so many things happen since the last time we've been able to have a conversation together. And I just would like to briefly just say some names because there's been so many. And even with the names that I say, I know there'll be many that I'm missing. Khalif Broder, the young man who committed suicide after having experienced the horrific conditions that he did at Rikers for years. We failed him. Eric Garner, obviously Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, recent Sandra Bland. There's so many names. I want to thank Tim for spending this time with us and helping to educate us and discuss the topics. But what I really hope for and what I'm going to ask is that whites will be courageous enough to educate themselves and to accept that there's a lot they don't know, and that it's time to grow up, and that this is on us. It's up for us to do. We always wait for others and to change the world, and we complain about society. But what we need to realize is that we are society. It's up to us. This is our job. This is for us to do. And with that, I want to thank you, Samaria, for being my co-host, and I'd like to thank you, Tim. I'd like to thank you, Tim.
Thank you all very much.
You're listening
All right,
to
it's a
Lyrical
wrap. Thank you, guys.
Rhapsody.
All right, talk to you next time.
All right, bye-bye.
Lyrical Rhapsody.
Thank you for joining us for this part 3 of the conversations with Tim Wise on Lyrical Rhapsody. To all of you who joined us, thank you for taking this time to learn more about one another. It truly is up to each of us to be the change we want to see in the world. Thank you, Gandhi. Take care of one another, and remember, the only love we have is the love we make, the love we create. So let's make a lot of love. Until next time, this is Jenny Love wishing you love, light, and peace.